Chapter 11 Taoku's Residences Bestowed by the Emperor, Home of Hutaktu. In previous chapter, we talked that upon entering the Zhangtai Gate, we may see the courtyard of the Yonghe Palace. However, the introduction of the imperial carriage pathway hasn't been completed. Let's be back and take a look. Today, there are 2 blocks of empty space, respectively, along both sides of the imperial carriage pathway of the Zhangtai Gate, planted with trees of honor guarding the pathway. These trees did not exist before. Neither did the empty space. Instead, the empty space had been covered with houses previously. 4 Taoku's residences, Chinese 4仓, were standing along the 2 sides, which were called Taoku's residences inside the temple. There were another 4 Taoku's residences outside the wall of the Yonghe Palace. 2 were on the Yonghe Gong Street, and 2 were on the Opera House Hutong, Chinese 戏楼胡同. Being outside the wall, they were thus called Taoku's residences outside the temple, Chinese 外佛仓. While repeatedly, the ones alongside the pathway were called Taoku's residences inside the temple. Focang is the residence of the Taoku. Why is the word Cang used to name it? Han Chinese usually call the grain barn Liangcang, which implies that Cang is not a place for people to live in but to store things. Houses ordinary people live were called Zhai, cottage or home, while high-ranking government officials and noble lords, fu, establishment. However, in Mongolia vocabulary, there is no fu. Word cang was a substitution to fu. Focang was consequently a term created by combining the linguistic and cultural elements of Han Chinese and Mongolian. Besides, ordinary Taoku's residences were not eligible to be called Focang. Theoretically, only the residence for the Grand Lamas, namely Lamas who were titled Hutaktu, was eligible to be called Focang. On the interspace of these Taoku's residences were 25 rows of dormitories of the Yonghe Palace, terraced dormitories for the ordinary Lama to dwell in. Namely, where did all the Lamas studying here live? They lived right alongside the imperial carriage pathway, in the terraced dormitories beside the Taoku's residences. In other words, viewing the space along both sides of the imperial carriage pathway in front of the Zhangtai Gate, residences could be seen ever, while today only trees and grass are standing still. Owning the Taoku's residence in Beijing in the past is equivalent to owning a flat in Beijing today, which was not easy. Owning the Taoku's residence demonstrated that the grade of the Taoku is super high. Taoku is graded into varieties of grades, which are at least 5. Since the Qing dynasty, only the first-rank Taoku was eligible to own the Taoku's residence in Beijing City, which was called the Taoku's residence inside the Beijing inner city, Chinese 城内佛仓. It was situated the areas inside today's second ring road. Only the first-rank Taoku may have his own Taoku's residence inside today's second ring road, and the residence was his own temple indeed. For instance, the second Zhangjia Hutaktu lived in Songzhu Temple. So was the third Taoku Zhangjia. The second-rank Taoku may also have his own temple in Beijing, but not inside the Beijing inner city. You had to live outside the Beijing inner city, which was called the Taoku's residence outside the Beijing inner city, Chinese 城外佛仓. Despite of the naming, it was actually not far. For example, Taoku's residences at Desheng Gate, Xizhi Gate, Anzhen Bridge were called Taoku's residence outside the Beijing inner city. These areas, which are demarcated into downtown nowadays, were defined as suburbs in the past. Where did the lamas from other cities live? You could not live anywhere that you would like to. There were strict rules in the Qing dynasty on the dwelling of the lamas. Usually, these lamas could live in the Xihuang temple outside the Anding Gate. Even lamas owning Taoku's residence outside Beijing inner city had to live out of the city. They were strictly forbidden to live inside the Beijing inner city. It was quite different from the situations nowadays, that a guru or lama may live anywhere, any hotels they want, as hotels are available everywhere. System of Taoku's residence stipulated where the lamas from Mongolia and Tibet should live. Though the system was effective throughout the reign of the Yonghe and Qianlong dynasties, the execution was quite lax. Some second-rank Taokus, Norman Hammer Hutaktu for instance, who de facto owned the Taoku's residence inside the Beijing inner city, which was the Puji temple. He lived there. Lamas from other cities also lived dispersely, including these 8 residences of the Yonghe Palace, 4 Taoku's residences inside the temple, and 4 Taoku's residences outside the temple. But in the 8th year of the Jiaqing Emperor, 1803 CE, 2 consecutive assassinations of the Jiaqing Emperor took place. Palace Gate incident, which terrified the emperor severely. The Yonghe Palace was a place that the emperor often came to serve incense. As mentioned, he would come at least 3 times every year or even more often. Due to the incident, an imperial decree was issued to strengthen the imperial guarding management, and the system of Taoku's residence for the lamas from other cities must be strictly executed. Additionally, from the Jiaqing Emperor, the lamas in the Yonghe Palace, also a Buddhist institute, were filtered and cleaned up. Ever since the reign of the Jiaqing Emperor, only Mongol and Tibetan lamas were eligible to stay in the Yonghe temple, while before lamas had been from varieties of races. When the Yonghe Palace was converted from a palace into a lamasery, Mongolian lamas had been dominant. However, as the highest institute of the Tibetan Buddhism, the lamas here were graded to 5 grades throughout the duration from its founding, as the palace to the Jiaqing Emperor dynasty. They were Han Chinese lamas, Tibetan lamas, Mongolian lamas, Manchu lamas, and Fanzhu lamas, which meant the grades were Han Chinese, Tibetan, Mongolian, Manchu, and Fanzhu. Fanzhu referred to people from places like India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Whom were Han Chinese lamas? Well, I would suppose you don't expect that. Lamas actually could be Han Chinese, but it was better not to, since castration was the condition to be the Han Chinese lamas in the Yonghe Palace. Actually, this case was because some court eunuchs wanted to adopt a monastic life. Thus, the Han Chinese lamas are also called eunuch lamas, and the other lamas did not need to undergo castration, but the Han Chinese lamas. After the strengthening of the imperial guarding management, only Mongolian and Tibetan lamas were eligible to study in the Yonghe Palace, and this had been continuing before liberation, but not afterwards. The 8 Taoku's residences outside the Zhaotai Gate were of the highest grade, which were distinctively titled Taoku's residence bestowed by the Emperor Chinese Ciju Focang. In other words, they were built upon the Emperor's order. Those who were eligible to live in the Taoku's residence bestowed by the Emperor were the most important Taokus ever in Tibetan Buddhism history. First, they were of high political status in Buddhist administration. Second, they were holding a corresponding post in the Yonghe Palace, while they lived here since they needed to work. There were 12 lamas designated to be of the high grade residing in Beijing. For instance, Jamyang Hutaktu, who was the Lebrun Monastery lineage, and Tuquan Hutaktu, Normanham Hutaktu, Jilong Hutaktu, Comolin Hutaktu, Akia Hutaktu, all of whom were the significantly important Grand Hutaktu in the history of Gelug. Hutaktu means incarnate Lama and generally refers to these who were just secondary to the Grand Four Takus in Taku hierarchy. The Grand Four Takus refer to the Four Takus lineage of Gelug, who are the Dalai Lama, the Banchan Deni, Zhangjia Hutaktu, Jetsun Denpa Hutaktu. Whether a school or sect of Tibetan Buddhism was eligible to build Takus residence in the Yonghe temple was a symbol of its religious status of certain Hutaktu. Not anyone was allowed to build the residence, but it truly demonstrated your status if you had one. Totally 140 lamas were conferred the title of Hutaktu during early Qing dynasty, and the number was over 250 by the end of the Qing dynasty. The earliest and most prominent Hutaktus were called the Eight Hutaktu, most of whom had built their Takus residences in the Yonghe Palace. Today, these Takus residences are no longer there. However, as said, these Hutaktus who had ever owned Takus residences in the Yonghe Palace at that time were of supreme importance in Tibetan Buddhism, and they had and have their local Takus residences because the Takus residences are the important religious sites. For instance, the Takus who ever built residence in the Yonghe temple owned accordingly the Four Ling temple in Lhasa, which are usually called the Four Ling temples of Lhasa. Comolin beside the Sera monastery presided by Comolin Hutaktu, Kundalin presided by Jilong Hutaktu, Tanyelin presided by Demo Hutaktu, Shidelin presided by Rating Hutaktu. These are the Four Ling temples: Comolin, Kundalin, Tanyelin, Shidelin. That's all for the four Nei Focang and the four Wai Focang alongside the imperial carriage pathway. Then let's move on to take a look at the gate courtyard of the Yonghe Palace.